Hi guys, can you hear me well enough? Sort of? We get closer. So, thank you for coming. My name is Tom Beller. I'm a professor in the English department at Tulane. And we're one down on the panel that we thought we had because Monique Harden had a personal emergency, family-related emergency. So it's going to be me who knows almost nothing, but is interested in Adrienne Katner, an assistant professor at LSU who works with water, who knows quite a bit. But I want to talk a little bit about how the panel, which has been slightly renamed after discussion with Adrienne and Monique, Corrosion and Corruption, how this panel came to the conceit behind it, I suppose. And with that in mind, I want to start with an anecdote about New Orleans, because I'm fairly new in New Orleans. I moved down from New York City in 2008, and a couple of years later, the Preservation Society in town put together a book. They asked a whole bunch of locals or newbie locals to write little reveries about special places, landmarks or establishments that they felt made New Orleans special. It was a promotional kind of enterprise. And then they published it as a nice booklet and so forth, just to celebrate the city. And my contribution was this house on Alvar Street that I had encountered just cruising around the Bywater when I was exploring the city for the first time, that I thought was really beautiful. It was blue, and it had this strange graffiti of a heart, and it was abandoned, and up the street was this, thank you so much, this, the local library, the Alvar Street Library, where I was told Lee Harvey Oswald had frequented as a child. Not that I'm a Kennedy conspiracist, but that added something. And mostly I just, there was this giant willow tree in front of the house, and all of its virtues were not incredibly unique to New Orleans, which often has beautiful houses in various degrees of sort of, I want to say rusticated disrepair, but rusticated is what you get at like, restoration hardware. It sounds intentional that, it's been distressed, whereas in New Orleans it's, dare I say, authentic, such a loaded word. So, but that was the one I focused on. I thought, wow, what a gorgeous spot, what a beautiful house, and the tree and the juxtaposition, and I wrote a bit about it. And as I was preparing my thoughts for this, I recalled that episode, both my initial enthusiasm, the fact that it got put in this book, and the fact that it's gone. Needless to say, that whole scenario has been renovated out of existence. It's no longer there. There's a house there, but that whole tableau that I was so responsive to is gone. And the reason I think it came to mind as I was preparing to moderate a discussion about environmental justice, and specifically about lead and lead in New Orleans, is the odds that the paint on the house that was blue and that was chipping, that I found so beautiful, had some degree of lead, if not on the surface of the blue, then in some layer behind it, rather high. And the odds that when this house was renovated and the paint sanded off, in all likelihood, stripped, that it was done in a way that, by the book, as the Department of Safety of Permits in this town would have declared the appropriate way. The odds that it was done properly, very low. Just, I can't imagine anyone would disagree with that. I'm not saying I know I wasn't there, but the odds are low. So, well, what do you do about that? It's all done. Sort of crying over spilt milk. But it was a dynamic just like that that introduced me to the subject, because if you sand a house that has lead on the outside of it, particularize the dust, suddenly little kids who are in the neighborhood or in the vicinity might touch the dust and put it in their mouths and have elevated lead levels. And this is going to find its way to Adrienne's work with water soon enough. But I want to say that at this point we come to what I think is a fascinating dynamic in discussing lead in America, in New Orleans. It's this sort of boilerplate paragraph that journalism usually, or even historians, have to insert I first encountered it when I was getting to know details about Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, and they'd say, the Khmer Rouge, comma, a guerrilla insurgency that sprang up at the end of the Vietnam War and killed 4 million Cambodians, comma, is holed up in the mountains of the, it's sort of like saying, there will be rain, comma, something produced by clouds when they become dense enough, or, you know, just how much explaining do you have to do? Well, certain things just need to be explained, reiterated all the time, and lead has this fascinating beat whenever you're reading about it in any kind of national publication, even serious, not wrap the fish with it, newspaper stuff, but more serious magazine journalism, where there's a kind of parenthetical clause saying lead, you know, which can cause neurological damage, you know, to developing brains, and spells out what that problem might be. And I'm fascinated by that banal, repeated clause, because it never seems to work, I feel, to transmit the meaning that it's trying to get across. It's never dramatic enough. It's just something, it's like the, you know, Hitler, you know, Nazi Germany, comma, which resulted in lots of people dying, and then it's too incidentally mentioned. But if you're on the receiving end of a drama with a kid, as I was, you then start to focus on it very much. And this focus was interesting to me because lead turned out to be a way of understanding all kinds of things about the way modern America has organized itself, you know, legally, politically, environmentally. And I was in the midst of a kind of self-directed study about this. I'd latched onto a guy named Howard Mielke, a local expert in soil and lead, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and among others. And in the middle of this, what I thought kind of obscure enthusiasm, I guess you could say, of mine, the Flint crisis broke. The Flint crisis for me was very confusing because the face of it initially was a scientist from Virginia named Mark Edwards. He was the scientist that citizens of Flint had sort of brought into town to test the water they were worried about, and he was the one that said, no, 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 this is actually a problem. We need to listen to these people. And from that point on, it sort of bubbled up into this national story and remains remarkably so, a national story. And what was incredible to me about this was once I started looking at Edwards, I came to understand that he had been through a crisis of this nature before. There had been a citywide panic about lead in the water, and unlike Flint, which is a poor black city in Michigan where the main industry, General Motors, is kind of gone, the first panic was in Washington, D.C. And it was front page news in the Washington Post, and there were Senate hearing committees, and you had senators whose name we would all be familiar with. Some of them went on to be presidential candidates saying, like, look, this is important to me because this is my tap water we're talking about, not only because of that. And then there was a kind of pushback. This is now, we're 2004 in Washington, D.C. There was a sort of pushback about the nature of the problem. And Edwards was put in the position of being told, like, you know, you're sort of wrong. It's not as big a problem as you think it is, and let's just, it was sort of made to go away. And then he turned into a maniac and spent several years as kind of trying to exonerate his scientific good name, and won accolades for the effort. He won a MacArthur Grant, Genius Award, and other forms of recognition. But, you know, 5 years after that, 6 years after that, I was reading about all this, and it was completely news to me that Washington, D.C. had had this enormous Flint-like crisis. It's sort of like corrections in the newspaper, which I actually endlessly find fascinating. Sometimes that's the best part of the newspaper, but generally speaking, if they get it wrong in the first article, the correction doesn't do too much to mitigate that. So the MacArthur Genius Award was like a $500,000 correction, but the larger picture is, I don't know, maybe you're all familiar with the great Washington, D.C. water crisis of 2004, but I wasn't. I thought it was strangely swept under the rug. Then Edwards himself was put in a very strange position in both fights, in both the 2004 water in Washington, D.C. fight and the more recent and well-covered Flint fight, and that is the position of fighting with the EPA. So the EPA did not build the pipe that had lead in it, and it did not, it didn't start the problem, but they were the ones who were supposed to detect the problem and prevent the presence of lead in drinking water from poisoning in this really insidious, infuriating way that lead poisons people, particularly kids. They were supposed to be the gatekeepers, or as Edwards put it to me, sort of the flag waver. Like, he described his thought about the EPA as like, we gave them a flag, and if there's a problem, they're supposed to raise the flag. But once the Flint story unfolded at some length, what became more and more clear was that they had not raised the flag, that there had been, without going too deep into it, but remarkably like Jean Le Carré-like dramas in which employees of the EPA on their own time went in and did testing and then tried to publicize within the EPA the findings of the tests that they'd done in their own time off of the EPA clock, that it was simply hard to galvanize the EPA to raise the flag. And I was talking to him right in the middle of this, you know, what was at the time an epically hot national news story, and he was very paranoid and fraught. It turns out he's like that all the time, but I thought it was just because he was being besieged. But I was like, can you just explain to me why this might happen? That you'd have a situation where citizens are being poisoned in a ghastly, difficult to measure, but infuriating way. This is another topic of what is that boilerplate, you know, neurological damage, what does that mean, how does that play out? I'll save that. Why, though, in this incontestably problematic situation, would they not raise the flag? And his answer was, let's say, incomplete. But the word regulatory capture was used, and I think I just sat in on a panel next door, and I have a feeling that's the phrase that's been uttered many times this weekend, and all of you are very familiar with, more so than me. So post-Flint, I started thinking about not just the soil and the building regulations and issues around paint in New Orleans. I thought, well, what's going on with the water? And that question led me directly to our single panelist, Adrienne Katner, who has a rather amazing, I think, or interesting, let's say, let me not oversell it. Let me lower the bar. A mildly interesting presentation. I do want to throw one biographical detail about Adrienne into the room because I find it deliciously complicating, and she's given me permission to ask all questions and things like that freely, so this isn't really a question. The biographical detail I find so interesting is Adrienne, who's a New Orleans native and grew up in Gentilly, is the daughter of Harold Katner, who ran the Sewage and Water Board. And so in our conversations about her findings regarding what's happening with water in New Orleans and her sort of mini version of trying to raise the flag and what the impediments to raising the flag are, or to having the flag be seen. To me, you know, we also sometimes circle back to, in so many words, you know, not what would your father do, but sort of cross-referencing what's going on now in her experiences and discoveries as a scientist now with events several decades ago when the city's water was in the charge of her father. So that is my introduction. Please give a warm welcome to Adrienne Katner.
Thanks, guys, for having me today. I want to make this very casual. This is one of the last talks, so please feel free to ask questions throughout my talk. On the note of my father, I did ask him about what was happening, and he was very ashamed of what the Sewage and Water Board had become. My father was a man of integrity, and he never would have allowed it to get to this level. He would have been upfront with the public, and I think that was the biggest lesson I learned from him. So Flint, what happened? I'm not going to go into a lot of details. Well, I am going to go into a lot of details, but only because that was the topic they gave me. A lot of people were exposed to lead in water, and the rate of childhood lead poisoning in the city doubled. And this is at a time when they were paying some of the most expensive water rates in the country, in the world. So it was a big letdown to the public, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how did we get there. So we've known for really thousands of years that lead in water pipes is toxic. They've known it since the Roman times. And they gave us warning about this issue back then. But if we needed a reminder, we had it in 1851. In New Orleans, Dr. Erasmus D. Fenner actually noticed that a lot of his patients were getting sick, were getting colic and lead-related diseases around the same years that they started laying out these lead pipes, water pipes in New Orleans. Now, he urged officials to do something about it, but the data that he had wasn't substantial enough for them to do anything about it. So we continued to use lead pipes well into the 20th century. And this is what a lead service line, part of a lead service line looks like. This is one that was removed from a home that I worked on in Tremay. By 1990, lead pipes were all over the country, and this is not a full list. This is a partial list. But lead is not just in lead service lines. It's probably in every home in New Orleans, every home in the country today, virtually in all plumbing. It's in brass faucet fixtures. It's in solder, galvanized iron, ductile iron mains, and your water meters. There was a great scientist, well, he still is a great scientist, Werner Troskin. He came out with a book called The Great Lead Water Pipe Disaster. And he'd been studying this issue for decades. And he'd gone into the history, and he said, this is a long-running environmental and public health catastrophe. A lot of people are, why do we care about lead? Why is it such a big deal? What we've learned is that there is no safe level, that the smallest amount of lead can have very injurious effects on the brain, especially in children that are still developing. And that effect on the brain can be permanent. This is a picture of the brain of an adult that was exposed to high lead in childhood, the areas in red and yellow, or where there's actually been reduced brain volume. So when I started out in lead and water, nobody paid attention. I would go to these conferences and I'd have 1, 2 people maybe. And it really, unfortunately, wasn't until Flint that people started to become more aware of the issue. Water was always considered an insignificant source of lead. You'd always hear about paint, you'd always hear about soil, but water, not a big deal. But early studies, even back in the 80s and 90s, they said water can contribute a great proportion of your total lead in your body. Bottle-fed infants most of their lead can be from tap water. And cumulative exposure, because this stuff bioaccumulates in your body, as low as 1 microgram per liter, which is the detection level for most labs, could lead to a 35% increase in blood lead level after a period of 150 days. A lot of people have talked about this. This is nothing new. We knew about this. A lot of people believe that, yes, low-level dose of lead from our water can have widespread impacts. Even levels that meet regulatory requirements have been shown to have lead poisonings due to water exposure. Now, over time, we've set standards for lead in blood, and those have been growing a lot more conservative. We recognize now there is no safe level. We have a reference value that the CDC uses of 5 micrograms per deciliter, but they say we see significant impacts in children at levels less than that. Around that time, EPA passed the lead and copper rule in 1991 because they knew we had a lot of lead in our plumbing around the country. This was one of the, this is really, lead and copper are the only 2 contaminants where the utility is required to go into someone's home and test the water in the home. Most of the testing is done at the plant. And this was a very unique rule. A little bit about the lead and copper rule, because I'll be speaking about it when I talk about Flint. It basically outlines what the utility is supposed to do to treat the water to reduce lead exposure. Corrosion control is one thing. We'll talk about that when I hit Flint. Testing of the water, of course. Now, the state can grant a lot of reductions in sampling, and after a year or two where there's no action level exceedances, the state can say, oh, you only need to do 50 samples in the whole city every 3 years to meet compliance. Now, the basic compliance measure is that if 10%, over 10% of the samples that a utility will collect, so let's say 50 samples in the city of New Orleans, if they exceed the action level, which is 15 parts per billion, then they have to do certain things. One is perhaps first, try to improve their corrosion control plan. Corrosion allows a lot of the lead from the pipes to leach into the water. They may also have to replace their lead service lines, and I'll get to that when we start talking about New Orleans. So the lead action level, what is it? It's 15 micrograms per liter, or parts per billion. This is important. It is not a health-based value. And the EPA never intended that it was a health-based value. EPA's health-based value is 0. So what that's saying is that 10% of tap water samples that a utility collects can have any level of lead in the water, even at hazardous waste levels, and it would still be in compliance with this rule. So Tom mentioned DC. I had just moved there at the end of this crisis, didn't know a thing about it. Never heard about it until I started working with Mark from Virginia Tech. Didn't hear about it because the public wasn't informed about it for 3 years while the water was exceeding these requirements. Mark Edwards, who worked on the Flint, also worked on DC and said this was much worse than Flint, worse than he's ever seen. During the time when the public wasn't informed for 3 years about this, he estimated that there was 2,000 children that weren't born due to miscarriages, 200 fetal deaths, and thousands of children that were lead poisoned. So this really underscored for the EPA, they needed to revise their lead and copper rule. Something wasn't working. And they had acknowledged that right after the DC lead crisis. And if they needed any more prompting, the Government Accountability Office also highlighted the problems with the lead and copper rule back in 2006, and there were several other reports. They acknowledged that this lead in drinking water is a growing problem and they needed to address it. So the call to update the lead and copper rule came shortly after the 2004 DC lead crisis, 10 years, mind you, before Flint. Now, it was never revised within that time, even though they had time to revise it. And this brings us to Flint 10 years later. Flint was experiencing, I don't know if any of you have seen Roger and Me, but it was experiencing a severe crisis. The industry had closed, people had left. They were thrown into poverty. With this decline, people migrated out of the city if they could afford it. And as they migrated out, you were left with a very impoverished minority population, and again, paying some of the highest water rates in the world. This is a picture of Flint on the left in its heyday, and this is a picture of that area in the 80s to the present. It basically collapsed. So they needed to save money. So they had been purchasing water from Detroit for a number of years, and to save money, the state had appointed them an emergency manager who was going to take care of all the money. And he decided that they were going to switch from Detroit to a new pipeline into the Flint water. And at some point, he made the decision not to use corrosion control, even though it was required. This was a very corrosive water source, the Flint River water. They cheered, they were happy, they were saving money. This is 2014. So once after the switch, people started noticing things. They were getting a lot of boil water alerts. General Motors said that they actually stopped using the water because it was too corrosive. And they started to get other exceedances that worried people. One of the big tip-offs that something might be wrong was the color of the water. Now, the government said, listen, your water is safe to drink. It meets the regulatory standards. This is iron. Iron's a nutrient. And they're right. And it's fine. It's safe. So people ask, a lot of people don't know that the Flint was actually compliant with the lead and copper rule. How could that be? How could they be compliant when we learned of such high exceedances later on? EPA has said, compliance with the lead action level does not guarantee or even imply that all individuals in the city are protected from lead and water hazards. I'm gonna let y'all sit on that for a second. Yeah.
I just want to point out that the word "all" in that statement is so insidious because if you throw "all" in there, it's like, look, okay, maybe 1% might have a problem. It implies that this could be a tiny problem. It doesn't mean that everything is. If you take "all" out, it's much more truthful.
So there's a lot of ways that utilities have used in the past to sort of minimize their capture of lead and detection of lead in the water. Some of these were telling people to go ahead and run their water the night before they came to collect, clean out your aerator filter, this is where the lead will collect, open the water very slowly, and by doing that, you're reducing the amount of lead that you're going to be capturing. Also, identifying low-risk homes, or not really making an attempt to ensure that the homes that they were sampling were high risk, as is required under the LCR. And also, first draw samples. Now, what we've learned about, yeah.
I just want, so you're basically there telling people, like, you don't want the highest levels of lead, or you want to make sure that you're flushing out the lead, so our samples are low. Is that what?
No, they weren't telling people that.
Okay.
So they're on the, so what a utility does is it comes in, gives you a bottle, gives you some instructions, and you collect the water that morning because you have to wait a 6-hour stagnation period. And that allows the lead to sort of equilibrate and get into the water. But what happens is the biggest source of lead in water is that lead service line, which is out in the street. The first draw that they collect in the morning is usually going to be representative of lead that's in the premise plumbing, not that lead service line. Now, that's the first draw. It's required. They are not required to flush and then take water that's been sitting in that lead service line. So Miguel del Toro, who you'll be introduced to again in Flint, has said that the current sampling protocols will often considerably underestimate peak lead levels. The surprising thing is that the water quality engineers and many of the regulators acknowledged all of these things years before Flint occurred. After Flint, there was a study by The Guardian that looked at all cities east of the, 81 cities east of the Mississippi. They found that about 33 cities and states actually defied EPA's guidance on how to collect the tap water, either pre-flushing or removing the aerator or collecting at low flow. It's about 41% of the cities that they sampled. Now, once you've gotten that bottle of water, and then you take it back to the lab, sometimes there are methods using or not acidifying the sample long enough so that you can collect that particulate lead. That can also lead to an underestimation of lead. EPA officials did some investigation of their own protocols and found that compliance testing methods can underestimate lead by as much as 99%. Mostly that particulate form that will adhere to the bottle, and they'll completely miss it in the analysis. So Miguel del Toro was really the first person who found out about Flint. And he wrote a memo to his bosses and said, listen, I have a problem here. They're not using corrosion control. This is a requirement. Now, Miguel del Toro basically said that after he said that, they shut him up, told him not to talk to the press, and put him in a corner to hold the plant. At that point, he just wanted to quit. But he had a little thing up his sleeve. He knew Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech. And he knew Mark Edwards' work in D.C. So he asked Virginia Tech crew to come down and do their own sampling. All around this time, one of the internal memos or emails came out from EPA saying, I'm not so sure Flint is the community we want to go out on a limb for. So corrosion control. We're talking about things like orthophosphate that will basically create a protective scale within the pipe that will prevent the lead from leaching into the water. It's needed. When you don't have corrosion control and you have very corrosive water, those metals can leach. And that scale, which can also collect the metals, can break down and be mobilized within the water. Now, we talked about iron. That was the main thing that they were finding. They weren't finding a lot of lead. This is just some pictures of some particulate lead pieces that can come off of the scale. These are small enough to get through that aerator filter that's at the tip of your faucet. The bigger chunks will collect there, so it's important to clean out your aerator filter every once in a while. So no corrosion control, very corrosive water led to a perfect storm for lead release. This is some pipes, some water pipes from Flint. You can see the corrosion on the inside. A lot of the protective scale is gone. About 50% they estimate, because not a lot of people know, they weren't really good records kept back then, that 50% of the homes in Flint had lead pipes. This is a picture of Dr. Mark Edwards, and this is when he started to get involved after Miguel del Toro contacted him. So Miguel asked him to go to this woman's home, we're calling her Resident Zero, and he started to collect some of the water and analyze them. He found levels above the lead action level of 15 parts per billion, way above. And he came back several times, and he started to investigate what was happening. This investigation sort of blossomed because you already had citizens that were very worried, very concerned. They weren't getting any help. Everyone was telling them the water was safe. So all of a sudden, he had this huge citizen science campaign on his hands. He had a 90% return rate of his water kits. So it went out all throughout the city. They found the highest overall level, and I think he found one higher after this, 1,051 parts per billion. So again, the non-health-based action level is 15. So we started, really, a campaign, putting it on the web and alerting people and making people aware because no one else was making them aware of it. He did experiments. He went to third grade classes and did these little experiments to show how corrosive the water was. What did the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality do? They said that this group specializes in looking for high lead problems. Basically, cutting him down. Now, another issue with Flint was that not only will lead and iron leach, but you have these biofilms surrounding in the inside of the pipes. And they can also be released into the water when there's no corrosion control. Iron also acts as a nutrient for a lot of these biofilm, these bacteria, Legionella being one of them. And what we saw between the time when they switched to Flint and they went back to Detroit was 143% increase in Legionnaire's disease. Now, there have been several papers on this. They've been going back and forth. There's been a lot of people who are saying it wasn't in the water. Essentially, we found that the evidence is pretty damn clear. But 12 deaths came from that. And that's an estimate because Legionnaire's disease is not really well documented in hospitals. Usually it happens in the elderly, people who are staying in the hospitals, and so people are thinking, well, they're just dying of pneumonia or something. So we know some other studies that have happened that when you have corrosion and the iron will start leaching, this is a nutrient, it can serve to sort of concentrate that iron and mobilize it and also deplete the free chlorine, which is a disinfectant that will kill the bacteria. And it can also act as a nutrient. So this is the last paper that was put out. Pretty definitive. I mean, you'd have to be really blind after so many studies now to see that there really was a link between the water quality and the Legionnaire's disease outbreak. Now, a public health doctor got involved. This is Mona Hana Atisha, and she put out an amazing paper. It was very well done, very well written, showing that there was a doubling in childhood lead poisonings. And what happened to her? Well, they said that this is becoming near hysteria. I wouldn't call them irresponsible. I would call them unfortunate, they said, of the doctor. Flint's drinking water is safe, and it meets all the standards. It only came out later that it was found that they actually cheated on the reporting of the lead in the water. So they actually had failed before. But they took off some of those fails, and all of a sudden, boom, they passed. So they were able to manage less than 10% with action level exceedances. Now, Mark has been through the DC crisis, through the Flint crisis, and he said, you know, I thought I was a normal professor. Normal professors with tenure don't maintain websites on which they publish incriminating emails obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. He didn't want to be in this position. He's never liked this position, but he feels an obligation. So what came of it? What accountability happened? There have been over 450 lawsuits, $600 million in relief, 3 congressional investigations, and 9 state officials were criminally indicted. But still, the EPA has not revised or updated its 1991 lead and copper rule. And this is almost 15 years now after DC, and they still want more time. Now, this whole case was evaluated by the Flint Water Advisory Task Force, an independent group that was pulled together, and they determined that this is a clear case of environmental injustice. That not only the people were not listened to, their concerns were not taken into consideration, and they were not allowed into the decision-making process. There was no accountability. I'm sure you guys have all seen this. This was President Barack Obama declaring that he would be beside himself if his kids could be at risk. Now, this lecture means nothing unless you understand what lead poisoning does to a child. And I won't go into that, but just say that it does permanently impact the brain. And you may not see these results until much later when they start going to school and they start having learning disabilities, attention problems, and boys, they start acting out and they can be more aggressive. And these lead to dropping out of school, crime, a whole host of other problems. Now, Flint wasn't alone. 17.6 million Americans also violated the lead and copper rule in 2015, or were served by utilities that violated it. And 1/3 of U.S. community water systems violated in some way the Safe Drinking Water Act. So nearly 77 million people get their water from those supplies. So we're seeing this cycle of water system decline where you have no corrosion control being used. In smaller utilities, in small towns, it's actually not required. I'm going to talk about that when we get to Louisiana. So you have these metals leaching, you have iron that's depleting the chlorine, just sparking the pathogens to grow. They deal with this with chlorine burns that can make disinfection byproducts, increased corrosivity, infrastructure breakdowns, leaks. It's just a cycle. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave the United States a D for their drinking water infrastructure. And last year they said it would be about $1 trillion for us to really get it back to repair everything. So water rates are going to increase. They've increased in Louisiana. I don't know if any of you live in New Orleans, but I just got like what was the bill? Like over a $600 bill for a month. Something's wrong, obviously.
Who are you looking at?
So what we're seeing is this is sort of disproportionately impacting poorer communities. You have communities that are impoverished. Many of these rural areas, these kids are going to get jobs in the cities. There's a reduced tax base. There's no money for repairs. All of a sudden, you have empty homes. The water is stagnating. The infrastructure is just led to sort of collapse. And then you have these water contamination problems, and then you have these disproportionate socioeconomic and health burdens on these communities. About a third of Americans are at risk of losing their water access by 2022 due to the cost. That's how fast these water rates are rising across the country. 50,000 Detroit homes lost service since 2014, and this is an old slide, so it's probably been a lot more. A lot of people around the country are worried about water. It's a big deal, 63% in the last Gallup poll. And that level has been increasing every year from 2015. But if you notice, a lot more of low-income people and non-whites, they're worried the most. So let me get here to St. Joseph, Louisiana, where I've done some work. Flint had already happened, and St. Joseph, a very similar situation. Population decline. It used to be a very big agricultural area, and all of a sudden, you know, it's down to a population of about 1,000 people. Mostly are African American, very low per capita income. Again, very, very high annual water bill. So it was very similar to Flint. There was no corrosion control, but this is a smaller utility and it's not required. They were also being told that their water was safe. It's just iron. There was, yeah.
Did they use well water or river water?
I believe they use well water, yeah. They were also given a fiscal administrator. They didn't really feel like they had any power or any voice. And so it really took the citizens to finally stand up and say, we want our water tested. We're going to do it ourselves if you don't. Unlike Flint, where the population waited about a year, in St. Joseph they've been waiting for 10 years for action on their concerns. State health officer said, it's fine. It's just an iron issue. It's not a health issue. These are some of the drinking water violations that we pulled from 2006 to 2017. Wilma Suber did a lot of work on this to pull this together. And what we see here is this pattern of failure to monitor for the chlorine, failure to report some of these violations, inadequate chlorine residual, coliform detections, public notice rule violations. That's when they have a problem, but they don't notify the public. So this is a picture of St. Joseph's drinking water. They didn't really have any solutions. They tried filters and they clog, needless to say. High particulate level, high iron, will clog the filters within a matter of days. So there was really no affordable solution for them. So they had to initiate action on this problem if they were going to get any resolve from this. The school was even called off because the water wasn't considered potable. Now this is, again, you know, primarily low-income town. You've got almost a little over 1,000 people living there. And then on top of all of that, the state actually wanted to help them. Had even reached out and said, well, hey, we're going to give you some money to help repair your infrastructure. But they couldn't release the funds because the mayor hadn't released his financial audit, which when he did, they found that he had pocketed $19,000 and given contracts to his family. So on top of everything else, they were dealing with this. They even petitioned the White House, but you need 100,000 signatures to get recognized. Again, this is a town of 1,000 people. They actually got 13,000, over 13,000 signatures, but it still was archived. So they reached out to me. They'd heard about what I was doing in New Orleans. And I never heard about this town. I'm a New Orleans girl myself. Nothing exists outside this city. I brought them, I had sent up about 5, 6 kits. I got 3 kits returned, and one of them had lead levels that were high enough to merit my concern, 23 and 42 micrograms per liter. So I sent those results to the state. Really nothing, to my knowledge, was ever done until citizens started getting involved. General Honore started putting his nose into this, and all of a sudden it became hot media news. That propelled the state to do their own investigation. And when they did their investigation, what they found was surprising. 22% of St. Joe homes exceeded the lead action level. By that, it violated the requirements of the lead and copper rule. But what was even more surprising, they found levels as high as 1,810 parts per billion. In Flint, it was a little over 1,000. They were finding 1,800 parts per billion in their water. And this has been an exposure over a decade or more. It's 181 times above the World Health Organization's lead standard, which they also admit is not health-based.
So you're saying the health standard is not health-based?
Yeah, so the World Health Organization standard is actually based on what is doable, what is achievable by developing countries, how low can they get their lead in their water. So it's based on technology, it's based on achievability of what they can afford. Yeah.
And the recommended level is 0.
The maximum contaminant level goal is 0. So they finally got some action. And this is in 2016. They got an amazing Christmas present from the governor. He declared a public health emergency, and they started to ship in water to St. Joseph, which they're still using to this day. Now, the state health officer estimates that St. Joseph isn't alone. When I wrote this, he said that he has an estimate of about 400. It's actually higher than that now. Towns that are facing similar corrosion problems. Enterprise was another town that reached out to me, and we did some sampling up there. Now, their concerns began when the utility actually found Enterococcus bacteria in their water. This is a fecal bacteria that's found in human intestines. So it means you have poo-poo in your water. This triggered a chlorine burn, and that by itself can lead to increased metal leaching if it's not done appropriately, adjusting the pH, things like that. And also an increase in disinfection byproducts, which is carcinogenic. And they had frequent exceedances of those disinfection byproducts. Also very, very high iron. So the water was also reddish. One of the residents there said it's like we're a third world country. So we went up there, we tested 21 homes. 71% exceeded the MCL for iron. This is a secondary MCL. It's not required to be enforced in most states. Again, because this is an aesthetic issue. It's a nutrient, it's considered an aesthetic problem, makes the water ugly. The chlorine residual, we could not detect any, which was surprising to me because I knew that they had just gone through a chlorine burn because they found the coliform. But we did find a lot of disinfection byproduct exceedances. About 76% exceeded the MCL for disinfection byproducts, which is a required standard, and it was an exceeded. Lead, 41% of, albeit 21 homes, a very rural area. I couldn't find it on the map. 41% exceeded that action level. I found levels as high as 103 parts per billion. Non-compliant. So it's not much, it's not very surprising that OPH was actually audited. their water program was, and they found that OPH can't ensure that they took appropriate enforcement action all the time. They didn't issue violations when utilities did not perform public notifications, and they didn't always follow up to make sure that whatever the violation was addressed. Now this brings me to New Orleans, because they asked me to talk about that. In New Orleans, we have a unique situation. We don't have very corrosive water. We don't have a lot of iron in our water. But we do have a really messed up pipe network. About over 50% the pipe network was estimated damaged after Katrina. And that meant we qualified for FEMA funds, and we got a lot of money to do repairs. One thing, when people started coming back after Katrina, your homes had been sitting there. The water had been sitting in your lines for a long time. People were coming back. And the state was actually finding pretty high lead levels in the water. So much so that we actually were not compliant with the lead and copper rule after Hurricane Katrina. However, regional EPA official allowed us to remove some of those higher homes. We had to give reasons. They had to give reasons for that. They did. They said no one was living in the home. And surprise, surprise, all of a sudden we're back into compliance, and so there was no requirement to educate the public about this as people were returning home. So what's going on all around the city, I don't know if any of you live uptown or in really all over the town, is we're having a lot of road work done. They're replacing some gas lines, but they're also replacing some water mains, some service lines. A lot of these are lead. They had a contract out for about 16,000 partial lead service line replacements. And let me see if I have to explain this. This is the service line that runs from the water main in the street to your home. Partial lead service lines mean they only replace part of the lead service line, their part, city's part. They leave yours, because that's your responsibility. A full replacement costs, over $1,000. A lot of these poor people can't afford to replace their side. So they don't. And so what you have are all of these partial lead service line replacements, which the EPA acknowledged a few years back can actually increase water lead for weeks to years. They've observed lead levels following these partial lead service lines high enough to be of concern from a human health standpoint. So much so, the Science Advisory Board said, we don't see any usefulness to these partials. If you're going to be replacing lines, you need to be doing full service line replacements. Now, this creates an environmental injustice problem. As your income grows, you're more likely to be able to do these full line replacements. You're more likely to have lower lead in your water. Of course, as your income decreases, you're more likely to be stuck with these partials, which increases the lead in your water. So this was a concern of mine because I knew about this study. So I knew there was also partials going on around town. So I found about 5 homes that were about to have them done. We did some pre and post water testing. And it was not really a big surprise of mine to find that 4 out of 5 of these homes had lead levels above the action level after the partials. After a 3-minute flush in one home, it was as high as 226 parts per billion. 2 days later, it was still over 100 parts per billion. 1 week later, it was still over the action level. And what we see in the literature is that it can still spike higher. This spiking of lead can occur for weeks to months to years even after these lines are replaced. What happens is they're physically moving these pipes, they're jarring them, the scale is coming off, it's getting mobilized in your pipe system. There's a lot of pipes and turns and corners in your house, and it can get lodged in and sort of serve as this endogenous source over a long period of time of high water lead. There was a study out here in Tulane of a person that simulated these partials with NOLA water and NOLA lead service line. Even after 2 weeks, he didn't see any stabilization of lead below the action level. And that's as far as the study went. It didn't go beyond that. So when I tried to get these results noticed by the city council, by the city health department, by the utility, and no one really paid any attention. And it wasn't until the Office of Inspector General got a hold of these results that they said, we're going to investigate this. In fact, they were actually doing an investigation of the Sewage and Water Board sampling techniques. And they actually said, we're putting this down. This is serious. This needs to be addressed. A few months later, they came out with this report. They had contacted experts, water quality engineers, regulators who knew this stuff. And they put together an amazing report. The Office of Inspector General said this is one of the most important reports we've ever released. The city is basically not telling people about the increases in lead that can occur, and New Orleans residents may have been unknowingly exposed to elevated levels of lead in their drinking water. Blight is another problem. The longer that the water sits in the line, stagnant, it can increase the lead as it equilibrates and goes into the water. This is an issue with schools, with daycares, with blighted homes. Schools and daycares where you have a weekend, a vacation, a summer where there's no water use unless that school is active in the summer. So even in stagnant buildings, we saw levels as high as 283 parts per billion. Now, the big thing that Sewage and Water Board pushes, and it's actually a requirement under the Consumer Confidence Rule, you have to tell people to flush their water. Now, there were a lot of studies that looked at that. People were saying, flush your water for 30 seconds to 2 minutes and you'll be fine. In the morning when you wake up, just flush it out, you'll be fine. The studies found that, nah, that doesn't work for every city, and we're going to change our rule, and we're going to say, yeah, tell people to flush, but all you cities out there with lead service lines, you really need to be investigating how long of a flush people need. How long of a flush people need? Everyone lives in different cities. Everyone lives in different homes in New Orleans. People have different length service lines. Some people on St. Charles might have a longer service line than other people around the city. So it's very hard to determine what is an adequate flush time for each home. You'd almost have to do it for each house. These guidelines still got integrated into public health guidelines. So these, this flush for 30 seconds to 2 minutes was basically repeated over and over again. ATSDR, state public health officials. It was on brochures, it still is on brochures and websites today. So I wanted to investigate, well, does that work? So we did some sampling. We actually had about 400 homes. This is an old slide. And we wanted to see, does it work? Does it work? After flushing for 30 seconds, after flushing for 3 minutes, does it work? And this is the first draw, water lead levels. 2% exceeded the action level, so we meet LCR regulations if I had done it if I had sampled the highest risk homes, which I did not, because I did not know. Because most people don't know if they have a lead service line. The 90th percentile was below 15. Now, when a city is compliant, the Consumer Confidence Report then says, on your annual report that you give out to people, recommend flushing, which they do. So I wasn't seeing any significant difference. In fact, after 30 seconds, over half of my houses still had an increase or no change in their lead. After 3 minutes, still just increase or no change in over half of the homes I sampled. It wasn't until I flushed for a good 6 minutes at high flow, mind you, at the highest it will go, that I finally started to see significant declines in their water lead levels. But it wasn't true for every house. We did some analysis. We looked at other metals to see what could be the source, and we came to the conclusion, lead service lines. Now, this is a slide of these homes that we sampled throughout New Orleans. 97% exceeded the California EPA's public health goal for lead in water. This is probably one of the only real well-documented health goals out there for fetuses and children. It's based on what we know about low-dose neurodevelopmental impacts on fetuses and infants. It's 0.2 parts per billion, 0.2. 97% of over 400 homes I sampled exceeded that. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics recently put out a recommended level of lead of water in schools. 1 part per billion for schools is what they recommended. About 73% of the homes that I sampled exceeded that. The FDA has their own value, 5 parts per billion for bottled water. About a quarter of the sites I sampled exceeded the FDA's standard. About 10% exceeded the World Health Organization standard, but only 7% exceeded EPA's non-health-based action level. So we were in compliance. We meet all LCR regulations. In general, I couldn't do a really good spatial analysis because I didn't have a good sampling in every area of the city, but what I was seeing was that it was these older areas. It was these older areas, but I was surprised. I thought the newer areas wouldn't have these issues. Well, no. New Orleans East, they do have these issues. Now, what we know about lead is that it's that first small elevation in the blood that can impact. Lead acts like calcium, which is involved in all of these different processes in our body. It just takes a little bit because what lead does is it binds more strongly to the receptors that calcium is supposed to bind to regulate all these processes. So it basically knocks calcium out and moves in. And it just takes a little bit. Just takes a little bit so you start seeing these issues. A little bit. Less than 1 microgram per deciliter. I really doubt that anyone here has less than 1 microgram per deciliter. You probably have more, especially if you're my age or older. Sorry. But because we have bioaccumulated it through our lifetimes, much of it is bioaccumulated in our bones, and that leaches out as we age, as we go through menopause, as we get pregnant. It's a problem. And then that can actually, in that way, especially if you're pregnant, you can expose your fetus to that. And that's where you're doing the most damage. Because that's where the brains start to develop. So and the weird thing, yeah, did you have a question?
You said you tested bottled water.
No, I did not test bottled water. I compared my tap water results to the bottled water standard.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But you haven't tested any bottled water?
No, and everyone asked me to do that.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to have to.
I think you should.
Yeah.
Also, when you ran it for 6 minutes at full flow, it's helpful. Do you know how long a period before it builds up again?
That is the big question. So how frequently do you have to do that?
Right.
And so these schools around the country that are turning to flushing as a solution, no. There was one study out that showed that even when a school flushed all of their water fountains in the morning, it was back up at lunchtime. So flushing is not a consistently effective method, and it's not a good way to reduce exposure. Yeah.
I was confused by the chart that used the geography of New Orleans by zip code when you were talking about older communities with older houses versus newer houses. I couldn't figure out, or just for example, where like we 70118 fit in. And in general, New Orleans just seems like a curiously counterintuitive example in which it doesn't break down so neatly as well-off people in the new houses. And so I just wondered if you could explain. What did the chart? Is there extra high levels down in Uptown and the Garden District? And
No, so I really can't make any statements of spatial significance of this. I just saw a general pattern of higher water lead levels in older homes. I did not have the sample size to make a statement that, yeah, I can say it's higher in this tract or that tract, because I really can't do that because I just don't have enough samples. So, but I can see a pattern, and the pattern fits with what we know.
wouldn't this chart say that if you live in a big house in Uptown New Orleans, you're screwed?
If you have a lead service line, or you have a galvanized line, or if you have a partial lead that has, exactly, because that can cause galvanic corrosion. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, if people are using not just bottled water like the kind that you have right now, but they're using water, say, from cat food or somewhere else, I mean, how safe is that?
That is a very good question and not one that I can answer. However, Mark Edwards has done a lot of sampling of some bottled water and he found that it's better than tap. But again, I mean, you really have to do a really thorough study.
And all of them was a flow and most I mean, that's a pretty expensive way to get around the water.
It is expensive. And oddly enough, a lot of low-income people that I surveyed actually prefer bottled water to something like filters, which are cheaper in the long run. So I'm trying to get over that stump. You know? Yeah.
Also, Kentwood and other bottling companies get it's New Orleans drinking water.
New Orleans drinking water, right
That's
here.
they go to the plant and get the water
Yeah.
and do something to it. They might filter out the lead or
Yeah,
I don't know.
now you can go to the national nsf.org and you can look up the bottled water of your choosing and see, you know, is it certified or how much lead does it have, or you can find more information out online. If you can't find any information about that bottled water bottle online, I probably would go to something else. Yeah.
Are they regulated the same as your personal family tap water, one part per billion, or is there regulations on that bottle of water you're drinking?
The FDA, it's regulated by a different agency, so the FDA will regulate bottled water, EPA regulates tap water, so there's different regulations. So actually, bottled water has a more conservative standard for lead in water. And we have, EPA set a higher standard just because everybody had lead in their water in 1991 when they set that rule. Yeah.
Now, is this a new problem as in because these municipal water systems are aging, because it sounds like it's from the transmission, it's not, the water leaves the plant, it should be good, by the time it gets to the tap, it goes through old water lines and old lead leads and old solder, so when it comes out of the tap, it's got the lead pumps.
Yeah.
Is this from the water systems aging, or is this from, some of these poor cities where now they're using less water, so less water is being put through the systems and sitting longer?
It's both. So you have a system where, we started to see there were a lot of lead studies in the beginning, the late 1800s, early 1900s, in cities where they were laying down these lines and they started to see problems. Now we're seeing problems because these lines are corroding, and that corrosion, that iron and those other metals can actually help to mobilize the lead. And so if it's stagnant for a long time, you also have that issue where the scale can kind of slough off, and there can be more leaching of these metals into the water. So it's a very complex system, like anything in the environment. There's multiple factors.
Lead pipe, copper is the lead solder. For galvanized, is the pipe itself, as the galvanization wears off.
I think it's the zinc coating, or yeah.
Is that wears off?
Yeah. And so it's an alloy with some amount of lead in it. And then, as two different metals, when you start to repair things and you're putting copper with, galvanized iron or lead.
Make an effervescent chemical reaction.
Yeah, and then that chemical reaction, that that sort of spurs more leaching.
Is there a cheap way, from an advocacy position, is there a cheap way that you can enable citizens to first check to see if they have a lead lead line, service line, and two, for them to check their water?
Yeah, there's a little simple test you can do with a key and a magnet to see if you have a lead service line or not, but, it goes under the ground. So there was one home where we thought she didn't have any lead service lines, nothing was visible on her side, but then when the sewage and water board came to dig it up, lead service line.
And you're often as kind of circles, you don't go, we discovered that up here, from where the meter was to where the water went in the house, it was a straight run, and it kind of meandered.
Yeah.
But is there a readily available, consumer level lead test for the water?
There is. Unfortunately, the sensitivity is not great, and so most of them will detect down to 15 parts per billion, which is the EPA's action level. The best ones to get, you can get them commercially, are the ones where you just collect the sample and you mail it off to a lab. And they do a GC analysis, and they can actually get down to a sensitivity of 1 part per billion, and that's you know, that's, if you have a child, if you're elderly, if you have any issues, that's really the area you should be, you know, concerned about.
The ones with lead paint, you can buy at Lowe's. and
Paint, yeah.
Stick it up against the wall and it changes from
Yeah.
lead paint.
They're not perfect, but they do allow you to see, you know, if you have a problem.
If you're buying gallon jugs of water at the store, distilled water, be a better option?
I think distilled water would be better. If you have a lot of bucks, you know, you can get a reverse osmosis unit.
Does distilled bill eliminate the problem?
Does it eliminate the lead problem? It should, but I haven't done an analysis of distilled water. So I think that that would need to be done, like a good study, and I don't know if there's one out there on distilled water. Like I think there's been some studies on bottled water, but I don't know if there's really good studies out there. And I think that there's some nonprofits that are starting to do this.
If it's good for the netting line. But it'll kill your fish. What's that? Distilled water will kill your dog.
Right, there's nothing in it, so it actually can pull minerals out of your system and kind of
Yeah,
automatically reverse it.
yeah. I mean,
Let's take this guy right.
oh, yeah.
This is like 3 questions real quick.
Mhm.
Okay, the ideal situation, the main pipe's replaced,
Mhm.
and then you replace all the piping on the private side. I'm believing that the new fixtures don't have lead. I may be wrong. The new fixtures, and then
There was a rule passed, I think it was in 2014, with the brass faucet fixtures, the amount of lead allowable was reduced.
And then, and isn't it also true that the solder, if you go with copper replacement, that if the solder doesn't have lead anymore? Or is that
If you have a lead solder, which most do,
still-
and you have a copper pipe, it actually makes it worse.
So what would be the ideal way,
Take out all the plumbing.
Okay,
Now,
take out
even
all
your
the
brass
plumbing.
faucet fixtures.
and what do you replace it with?
Guys, can I interject just for a second? Because I just saw the clock and we're area coming to the end of the talk, and I know, at least for me, there's a sort of small bombshell in Adrienne's talk or in the story that she's telling us.
I can
So
talk to you.
let's let her get a bit further along, and as you wish, and then we'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end shortly to pursue a few other questions.
Okay.
The
So,
bombshell, if I may say, had to do with your version of the response to the findings that you've had.
okay. You want to go there? All right. All right. All right. Let me get. All right. So this is, you know, I'm coming to an end. There's an end to this.
Not the problem.
So this is really, you know, what Flint did was it really raised awareness about this issue that water quality engineers really knew for a long time. Scientists had known for a long time, but finally it was really in the public awareness now. And it broke people's faith in government. So, you know, there have been several, you know, GAO reports looking at this issue. You can find them online. But we know that lead is pervasive in just about, you know, every home. Corrosion control treatment is not sufficiently enforced. It's not even required for these small utilities, these small rural areas. Our lead and copper rule is very weak. And we know that there has actually been cheating on these lead sampling, how the water is collected, et cetera. So what we've seen is that there's this culture of compliance that's focused more on meeting regulations than on really addressing public health issues. There's all kinds of ongoing LCR issues that still haven't been addressed since DC, 15 years later. Problems with oversight, problems with enforcement, problems with partials that's still required in cases where a city won't meet the lead and copper rule and they can't get their corrosion control to work. There's unlawful exclusions, no public alerts, lack of transparency. It was hard for me to get data. I had to resort to Tulane's law school to help me with FOIAs to get, and Public Record Act requests to get data. inappropriate sampling protocols, which which is being investigated. And really, we still don't have an enforceable health-based standard for lead. We know that there is no safe level of lead. This stuff bioaccumulates. Ladies, if you want to get pregnant one day, this stuff is staying in your bones, and it keeps, bioaccumulating. And as you get pregnant, you can leach that back out. Now, the EPA has started developing what the advisory committee asked them to sort of develop a action level that's below 15, where that would trigger some kind of public enforcement or public education. They're calling that now a health-based lead standard, and that scares a lot of people.
Why?
Because we know that there really, even a little bit of lead, if you're a child, especially if you're a pregnant woman, can have serious impacts because it adheres so strongly and it pushes calcium out of the way, which is responsible for so many processes in our body. So they were tossing around a blood lead level of about 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, and they did some models, ran some models, and figured out that if you're a formula-fed infant, using reconstituted formula, unfiltered tap, and you live in a house built before 1950, you need about a water lead level of about 3.8 parts per billion or microgram per liter to exceed this new, theorized blood lead level, which is based on national data of blood lead levels. And the CDC is considering reducing it. We haven't heard yet if they're going to do that. About 19% of the city's water that I sampled, over 400, over 1,000 samples, over 400 homes, exceeded that water level. So this has really brought up a lot of environmental justice challenges. We have our infrastructure is over 100 years old. We have water rising rates in the city of New Orleans, around the state, around the country. Pretty soon it's becoming unaffordable. I'm thinking about, going groundwater, doing my own well, but then we have that problem, with the saltwater intrusion. We also have these problems with the partials that are going around, that are happening all over the city. When partials are done in a city that's compliant with the LCR, there's no requirements to educate people about the risks associated with that. Only when a city is non-compliant with the LCR are the utility then required to educate citizens about the risks of partials. What happened in DC was an issue with their change in their disinfectant. But when they started to do these partials all around the city, the problem came back again. So, it's a systemic problem. It's not just with the environmental officials. I'm in public health, and in public health, CDC puts out our guidelines, and they have said that if a city meets the lead and copper rule, when you go into and do an investigation on a child that's lead poisoned, you don't need to test the water if the city's compliant, unless you can't find any other source. And pretty much that was the status quo in Louisiana. They really didn't do water sampling in any of these lead-poisoned children's homes. And over the country, really, very few utilities would do, or states would do this kind of water sampling. Because, again, it was soil, it was paint, it's house dust, water wasn't an issue. So we really don't know. We don't have a really good database of lead and water in the children of these homes.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to let everybody know that the keynote is starting at 4. You're more than welcome to stay and continue the conversation. I just wanted you to know it's 3:59, but you're obviously more than welcome to stay.
So at this moment, if anyone wants to get up, I'm closing my thoughts. But if you want to get up, go ahead. So my closing thoughts. This is a national issue. It's not just Flint. And every city will have a little bit of a difference in the extent of the problem. It can cause a further environmental justice problem. And we need a few things. We need there to be a lot more transparency in government and utilities. We need citizens to be included in the discussion at the table. We need to enforce these misconduct policies when we see officials allowing these things to slip and not enforcing the law. We need resources, and especially in these low-income towns. But more importantly, we need to put in the hands of people low-cost, autonomous solutions that they can do in their home in the event that their city, their state is not doing a good job in enforcing the lead and cop rule. So I think I'll stop right there. I just want to acknowledge some people, Mark, particularly Mark, because when I got started with this, again, everybody was telling me, don't do lead and water, it was silly. And he was like, do it, do it. Of course, I have a lot of community partners. Wilma Subra, Janie Jones, and St. Joseph and Enterprise have really been invaluable on the ground people to me to get these samples out and these water kits out. People in New Orleans, Beth Butler and Marie Hurt. Miguel Del Toro, who's been advising me since the start of my study. And I was actually sort of in the early moments of Flint, he was emailing me and saying, I've got a really bad problem here. Of course, and Howard Milkey too. So, questions?
Before we get the questions, can we just